So here in Panama, when in 2004, when that first happened, and I became 2005, I started working here to find a way to market the coffee, the geisha coffee that my family had discovered on that farm in Jaramillo, and we weren't really sure what the deal was with that coffee, except that it was floral, and that it was. We found out that it was an Ethiopian landrace. We found out where it had come from. We found the history behind it by going back through Katie, because we had gotten that, and the person we found out through the person who there were two people that brought that variety to Panama. One person was called Pachi Serracin, who worked with the government. Another person was a Tedman. Actually, yeah, a Tedman, Frank Tedman. And so we're not really sure of those two people which brought to our farm. We actually think it was Tedman, but Pachi Serracin was the one who was doing consulting, let's say, for my dad at that moment. And when my dad looked at all the coffee down there, and they were trying to decide what to plant on the upper portion of that new farm that we bought in 1996. My dad is a biologist, or he's a scientist. He has a PhD in anatomy. So he looked at the coffee plants and he was like, well, this one plant is definitely doing much better than the other plants. They've got funguses on them because it was a very rainy season. So he chose from one plant, not based on anything other than the fact that that plant was healthy during a rainy season that had a lot of fungus. They made a nursery of the seeds from that one plant. And Pachi Serracin told us that, or told my dad, that plant is called Geisha, and it's accession 2722. I remember because I brought it from Katia. So we went back to Katia, and in Katia we found the records about where that came. It came through first Kenya and then Tanzania. In Tanzania, it was called VC 496. And I forget what it was called in Kenya. It also went to the Kew Gardens in London. But anyway, we did the traceability to find out what it was called, and it arrived here under the name Geisha with an I, 2722. Actually, TA 2722 because it came from Tanzania. So it was Geisha. There were 12 different varieties that were called Geisha, and this was one of those. And it had been brought to Panama back in the 60s to so the genetic diversity of coffee here in Panama was very small, because we had everything was either like a hybrid or a mutation, or actually a seed from Típica, or so we had Típica, what was the other one called? And Bourbon. And all of the Bourbon came from the Reunion Island, and all of the Típica came through Holland to all of the Americas, and spread through the Americas from a very small genetic base. So Panama's idea in the Ministry of Agriculture was to increase the genetic base, or have more of a genetic base in terms of coffee. So, and that coffee was planted here in the 60s in Panama, but everybody cut it out because it was a very, very low producing variety. So most people didn't have it. And this was, so when we bought that coffee farm in the 90s and late 90s, it was being auctioned. Somebody had lost it. It was being auctioned by the bank. And since it was an abandoned coffee farm, it still had that variety on it. And so we replanted in that without knowing that it was a very low yielding variety, because that part somehow was never told. And we didn't know about the flavor because we're talking about late 90s. Here in Panama, we didn't learn how to cup until the beginning of the year of the 2000, early 2000. We didn't, none
Yeah,
of
that's
us knew how to cup.
pre-specialty coffee in the 90s.
For sure, for us, it was pre-special. We had no idea. So fortunately, we were lucky in the sense that we bought the farm in 96. We did the nursery, and then we planted it in 98, I think. And in 2003, we had the first crop from there. So that first crop, my brother went up to Royal Coffee, where he was just starting to intern in coffee because he had just graduated from college. He went up to Royal Coffee, and they cupped it there. And he took a Palmira coffee, which is our regular, the original farm, and he took a sample from that farm. And the people in Royal were like, oh, these taste really, really very different. So what's going on here? And then when he came back the following year, in 2004, he separated the coffee from that coffee farm that was tasting so different into different parcels. and found that this one coffee that we had replanted on that farm tasted just very different than all the rest. And that year, fortunately, Rick Reinhardt, who was the executive, well, who later became the executive director of SCA, was here. He used to be a coffee roaster from Southern California. So Rick Reinhardt was here in Panama giving a class for a cupping class to people here in 2003 and 2004, sorry, same year. So already some people were learning how to cup. Daniel had sort of learned how to cup. There were a couple of people who were learning how to cup. He did this cupping course and he put it on the table and he really thought it was an Ethiopian coffee. And so he was like, wow, this is like an Ethiopian on steroids. You should put it into the Best of Panama. Fortunately for Daniel and for our family, he had tasted it. So when he tasted it on the cupping table, he wasn't like, he argued for that coffee to stay because he knew that it was not he knew that it had been produced here in Panama. Just to give you some context, 2003, the year before, if you ask the Kai Jansen, for example, he'll tell you that they submitted a coffee in 2003 that has some florality to it. It was called, I forget the name of that variety. It's not a very well-known variety, but it was probably original landrace variety. And the group of international judges who was judging here in BOP in 2003 said, no, that coffee does not taste like a Panama coffee. That coffee should be disqualified. So that's why I say we were lucky in 2004 that Rick Reinhardt had tasted this coffee, because our coffee probably would have been disqualified from that competition. That would have been the end of geisha coffee if that had happened, because we would have been like, okay, well, yeah, it's not going to work, but it didn't turn out like that. So other judges then became involved. That was the year that that God in the Cup, I forget the guy's name who said, I saw the face of God in a cup. All those cuppers were there that year. Rick Reinhardt was like, yeah, this coffee, I tasted it before. I was, actually, now I think about that, that's a weird thing. But there were, Best of Panama back in 2004 was very small. There were very few. There were about 15 coffees, maybe less.
Wow,
So
what a
that was
fortuitous story with
Yeah.
buying.
Everything was luck. It was luck with my dad. No, choosing it because of a fungus, because it didn't have high fungal
Yes.
problems. It was luck because there was somebody here at that time who was like, yeah, don't kick this out. This is a good coffee. And it was luck because we were learning to cup at that time. So we were all learning how to differentiate flavors at that same time.
Just all the dominoes lining up about as perfectly as possible.
It's all about the stars lining up on one year. So that is how that happened. So then in 2005, I came on board to try and figure out how we could market a coffee like that, because so in 2004 in the auction, it sold for the wonderful price of $21 a pound, which was record breaking. It was like beyond belief of anybody back then, which is insane now, but it was huge. So all of these international coffee roasters all of a sudden were super interested in this variety and in this coffee. And they bought it and then they wanted to know for the next year and this and that. And then we had a couple then the next year in 2005, it also went into it also won, BOP. It went for like $20.50 or something like that. And then, so we started to think, well, how should we market? How should we be selling this coffee? We started looking at things like, we didn't actually look at Indonesian coffees, which we looked at things like island coffees. We looked at, Kona coffees. We looked at Jamaica Blue Mountain. We looked at Puerto Rican coffees. Island coffees always commanded Saint Helena coffees. They always commanded a higher price for some reason than other coffees. So we said, okay, let's try 50. Back then it was around $15 a pound, which was insane for us because all of our coffee was sold around $2 a pound.
Yeah.
So we said, okay, let's go for $15 a pound. And the roasters were okay with it. People were okay with it. Of course, there was very little of it back then. And then we started working on, okay, how do we get it out there to more people? How can more people, the BOP, of course, is a good place for a lot of people to try it. But that's how our own single estate auction came up in 2008. We started doing our own private auction, and it helped us very much to get the geisha coffee out there to a whole bunch of other people who otherwise wouldn't have known what it was like. And yeah, we've been doing our own private auction now for 17 years. This 2025 will be our 18th auction, private auction. So that is basically the story. And then, of course, in 2004, when we first found that the geisha variety and all that. And then 2005 2014, 2005 people were still like, oh, this is probably a fad, it'll pass. And then 2006 even since earlier, our neighbors were like, oh, can I have some? Can I try it? Can I plant it? And so my dad started giving it out to people, first to neighbors here in Panama, but then to neighbors in Costa Rica, in Colombia, in Bolivia, Taquesi, for example, in Guatemala, El Injerto, all of these people he started giving out the coffee to because, I mean, it wasn't ours to keep anyway. It was a coffee that had come originally from Ethiopia, so it really did belong all over the world. But it was kind of strange that midway through it became contentious that we were calling it geisha because people want us to call it gesha because of the Japanese, let's say the Japanese artist, but at the same time, it's a completely different product. So we continue here in Panama to call it geisha, whereas most of at other parts of the world they call it gesha, but it's obviously the same thing. At the end of the day, it is there was no alphabet, there's characters, so it's like a pronunciation of the word. How is it really pronounced? And the way that we received it, the way that this, so is a Captain Whaley was the original person to take the seed out of Ethiopia, and Captain Whaley wrote it with an I. So that's how we ended up with geisha with an I, because that's how we interpreted the word to be spelled. So yeah, that is basically.
Do we know why he called it that?
Yeah, because it came from the geisha forest, and it was called in Ethiopia the geisha forest, and he interpreted that to be spelled with an I, or that was how his translation of how that hears. He wrote it that,
right.
I mean, I can tell you if you want to call Willem Boot, for example, because Willem Boot went to Ethiopia to try and find that coffee in the geisha forest, and they couldn't find it there. I mean, they never were able to relocate it in Ethiopia. They were able, I mean, there's so many Ethiopians that are floral. I don't know why geisha would stand out there. There's so many other coffees that they can choose to plant or to make a cultivar out of that they don't need it anyway. So, but I do know that he took it back there. So that is what they have.
I mean, we can also trace it back from the genealogy that it had to have come from, well, at the very least, Africa.
Oh, of course. No, it definitely came from Ethiopia, right? Yeah, we know that or according to what we've learned, let's put it that way, all Arabica coffee originally comes from Ethiopia.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know. I'm not a historian either or anything, but that's what
we've got to follow the genealogical records, which indicate or strongly suggest that, right?
Right, correct. So yeah, that sounds like it would be right. So we also have so we have 400 different Ethiopian accessions after that we got from Katia. We planted in one of the farms, the northernmost one, the one that's called El Velo. And now we have a landrace blend that we get out of there. But we also chose three of those accessions to replant in other parts of the farm because they're just very floral and interesting varieties. I mean, they're not varieties yet, but that's the difference between an accession and a variety. So geisha accession 2722 is now, once it's been cultivated, it becomes a variety, and it's being cultivated all over the world now. So that becomes a variety once it's being cultivated. And these other ones that we've chosen are just still numbers. They don't have a name yet. I don't know if I'm explaining.
Is that because of how prominent they are in kind of the coffee farming culture? Until enough farms or enough of a harvest of it happens, it doesn't become its own variety?
It doesn't become its own variety until it's actually being cultivated. And right. these varieties or these accession numbers, as far as I know, are not being cultivated anymore.
So these are only in Hacienda La Esmeralda.
And in Katia, because we got them from Katia, and in Ethiopia, and maybe wherever else Katia has shared them with. They could be in several other places. As I said, they had 400. They have a core Ethiopian, they have their core collection, and then they have this 400 landrace variety collection that we chose, and we've been cupping out for many years now and trying to figure out which we like the best, because originally, honestly, we chose two varieties and we planted two accession numbers. We planted them out and then we didn't really like them and then we had to take them out. So we waited a longer time this year to make sure that we thought that they were stable enough and that they were going to remain, that they were going to still have all these floral notes or attributes that we're
Can we
looking
dig more
for.
into that process of, obviously you've got the tried and tested, in some sense, geisha varietals, and now how do you decide which of these more experimental tasting notes to either look for or test out?
Honestly, we look for, right now, there's nothing more than, well, no, it's not that there's nothing more. The first important thing is a huge florality to go with it. Now, that florality has to be accompanied by a good mouthfeel and it has to have body. So it has to be able to sweeten up. So that's the way. But the florality is the number one thing. Florality is elusive. Florality is hard to keep. I mean, you can lose it in the roast. You can lose it before the roast. You can lose it during the process. So florality. We looked at very high floralities, and a lot of them have high florality, but the most floral ones were the ones that we chose. The ones that we've noticed over the past, and we've been doing this for at least 5 years because we've had this since 2013. We've had the 400 varieties. The ones who consistently over the years have had the most impressive scores on our cupping table. So
And
my
what sort
brother
of
Dan,
things do you ensure to, when you identify this new harvest looks like it's going to be more floral? Is there anything you can do on the farming side to either cultivate or grow that from the farming
well, there's no way that
practices?
we can know if it's going to be more floral. It's not going to be more floral actually in just by looking at the harvest. It's
Okay,
when we have it, we've processed it and we have it on our table that we can be like, oh wow, this is amazing, or what happened? Like, where are the florals? It can go either way, and that is just part of being a producer of geisha coffee. That you might have a great year one year and that coffee, and everybody else next year will want that same coffee because we're like, oh, that is the
of
most.
course.
The next year, it turns out that it's not as floral as it was, or it has a year off, or whatever. So yeah, it's the elusive florality that every producer is always looking for. Of course, that has to be accompanied by everything else that makes a good coffee. But the principality of it is a big, it has to be like a booming florality. It has to be, wow, like, oh my gosh. And it has to come through in the cup as well. Like it can't only be in the aromatics. You have to be able to, in the cup, be like, I can, in retronasally, I can still taste the florality. So that is what we look for all the time. And that is always going to be the way that we are going to choose the coffees that we think will be best for some competition. So these are competitions like the Best of Panama competition or like the Esmeralda auction. But there are different types of coffees that we will produce for other things like competitions, where we're going to have hopefully that florality, but as well, we need things like other things that they want, more funkiness or more body. It's never funky. We're never really funky, but a little bit more body or a little bit more fruitiness to jazz it up for some sort of a competition, because the competitors always need something that's a little bit more jazzy,
I was going to say,
than
with some of the competition level beans, the complexity tends to kind of be a little bit overpowering sometimes, which again tends to
what I
score really well.
the truth of the matter is what I used to think was great for competitions, I no longer think is great for those types of competitions. For the Best of Panama, I know what we can put in Best of Panama. I understand how the Best of Panama works. But for Brewers Cup and Barista, the window of the judges tasting that coffee is so small and in such a specific time frame that they have to impress them, in different ways. These judges do not have the time to go through and smell, and they're exhausted. Their palates are exhausted. They've been cupping like over and over again. So it's a different type of coffee that we would suggest for somebody. I would never suggest a 2,200 meter, for example, coffee for somebody who is going to compete in a Brewers Cup, because it's at the moment where it's beautiful and delicious and wonderful, you don't know. I mean, it's good to have that all throughout. And the wonderful thing about a complex coffee is tasting it throughout the different parts of it.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that, and if you can't taste it until it's stone cold, and you don't have that whole, let's say, journey of the coffee, then it's not good, because they're not going to be able to see all of the small details that this coffee can bring out in different moments as it's cooling. So yeah, we have different things for a competition like a barista or a brewers, even though I'm not saying that barista or brewers, can't, of course they know the difference between a very high elevation and this, but for the good of a competition, there's other coffees that are more stable, or let's say they behave almost the same way from beginning to end, that are better for that type of a competition. Or at least that's something that I believe, because I have been working with competitors over the years for different things, and they always say, okay, want this. But when it comes down to it, what they need is something different than what they might want. They might say, oh, I really want a washed geisha, which, by the way, this year won I think it was the washed geisha that won the barista competition, which was amazing, because everybody else used the natural and the barista for the geisha. Because everybody thinks they want a washed geisha, but when it comes down to it, and I put it down on the table and they compare it to a natural, we do very clean naturals. Most people actually want the natural. So, because it
I
has more
feel
body.
that's the perennial problem, customers saying one thing and then going for something else
Yeah.
with their actions.
Because and, it sounds nice and all that, and it is great. I'm a washed geisha, like, all the way. I drink washed geisha constantly because I love washed geisha, and I've been doing it for basically 20 years. I can also love some naturals, but in my life, my day-to-day, I'm going to prefer a washed geisha. It's just, I love it. What can I say? It's my preference. But when people say, oh, I want to wash geisha, so I'll be all excited and put out all the washed geishas, and then it's like, okay, you really want it natural, that's okay too. That's okay too. There's, something for everybody. We do try, we have a whole bunch of different processes. We have, if we're going to do a wash, we can do a simple, I think you guys probably call it aqua pulp, but mechanically you remove the mucilage, both the pulp and the mucilage. That is one option we have. We have fermentation where we remove the pulp, and we have an ambient fermentation. We have a fermentation where we ferment at cooler and a cool refrigerated fermentation to control the fermentation more. And from there, we can go to the drying, which can be patio dried, for example, like that. Obviously, that's not going to be a very high-end one. It could be patio dried, or it could be Guardiola dried, so machine dried. But then from there, we can have the African bed dried, and we can have it dried in a cold room. So, and this climate control room is going to control both humidity, and it's going to control the temperature of the drying of it. So we have a whole bunch of things for different people depending on what you're looking for. And it's interesting to see the range of things that people choose. And it's like, no, this is my favorite. This is my favorite. So,
How are those processes decided on? Is that demand from the customer side, or from we expect this process? And kind of how much of that is based on these process brings out these flavors, different
most of that
drying
is
rates?
defined by space, unfortunately.
Does that
So
make sense?
what we have to do is most of the time it's going to be patio and Guardiola dried. At the beginning, sometimes we don't know, and we don't have any space at all, and we're just going to dry it wherever we can dry it.
Yes.
But once we've realized how the crop is looking, we're going to try and machine dry or patio dry either naturals that are not super high elevation, or not coffees from regions that don't excel most of the time, because favorites for roasters worldwide, African beds or climate control. I mean, that's just, there's patio dried used to be what roasters wanted, because there was we didn't have back then all the other stuff. We didn't have we had patio dried.
Oh yeah, the climate controlled stuff, that's much
back
more
then we
recent.
had patio dried and machine dried, and when there's patio dried and machine dried, roasters tended to prefer the patio dried, which 20 years later is super interesting to me, because now when I try a patio dried, it's like it's just very different. It's a very different flavor than what we usually offer as an Esmeralda special. So some of them can withstand the patio. The problem with patio drying here in Panama 20 years later, which is part of the thing too, is, temperature. It's getting hotter. So the patio between the concrete, the coffee, and the sun on top, if we patio dry now, we used to be able to leave it out like most of the day. Now, if we patio dry, we put it out 2 hours in the morning, take it off. and then maybe 2 hours in the afternoon, take it off. And the next day the same, because you cannot leave it out. It'll be dried in 2 days. And then what do you do with the water activity? Because then it's going to take whatever time for the water activity to actually stabilize, and you're not going to know where it's at. Now, I guess what I'm trying to say is everybody has become much more technological about what we do. We can measure things and we can know what's going on more than we did.
Are you able to share more about that measurement? You mentioned obviously water content, drying rates. How do you log and track those kinds of things?
So we used to just take it down to, let's say, we were taking the wash to 11.5. We took the naturals to 10.5% humidity, and that was that. Over the years, we started to realize that florality could be also associated with how much humidity level there was in certain years. So we started tracking other things, like how can we dry it with the humidity control, and how can we check what's going on with the water activity inside of it so that it's stable. For example, I jumped over naturals because I actually jumped over a wash. We do an anaerobic wash coffee as well. So the anaerobic natural coffees, for example, in my opinion, are less stable. The water activity of them is less stable, and it will change in a couple of months. So you just have to make sure that when you sell the coffee, the water activity is at a point where it's going to be stable enough so that the end buyer is not going to buy something at the farm and end up with something different when they receive it. Have you tried the climate controlled yet?
Not yet.
Have you tried? Not yet. Okay. Okay. They're different. They're interesting too. Some people prefer them, some don't. I definitely prefer it in the natural. I am still on the fence in the wash, but it was very popular this year. But I mean, one thing is just something that's brand new. Another thing is like, okay, let's see if it stands up to, time. Will it be that way next year too? Let's just wait and see. So these climate controlled rooms, we have three. We had Hacienda Esmeralda has been always half dairy and half milk and half coffee. So
Right.
since we moved here I moved here in 1973 when I was 5 years old.
Right.
So we started in the late 70s, my father started doing dairies. And so half of our farm is dairy cattle and half of our farm is coffee in terms of let's say the importance, or even in everything, half and half. It's basically how it works. So we had a cheese room for the dairy, and that's where we first did our climate control experiment in this dairy cheese room. And then we have another room that we did in our warehouse, in our beneficio, that we did it originally only to rest our coffees, because we felt that once we harvested and we had our coffees resting, that they were losing quality because it was becoming so hot inside of that warehouse. So we had done this climate controlled room for resting the coffee originally, but then we realized that we didn't have enough coffee at the beginning to put in there, and we started drying the coffee in there too. And then we realized, so we had more climate control. And then the one that is the anaerobic. So the other room where we call cool fermentation is where we do the natural anaerobics and the either washed fermentations or washed anaerobics as well. So, yeah, it's just things that start evolving, and you start seeing, well, maybe this is super important. To me, one of the most important things, which I'm going to be super honest about, is I want my coffee's life to be as long as possible. So originally, back when in 2017, I think it was, or something like that, I was invited by Lal Cafe to go to France on this yeast, L'Allemande, and this is coffee yeasts produced by Lal Cafe.
Okay.
So they kind of wanted me to be interested in fermenting coffee with yeast. So back in 2017 or 2018, we started doing some experiments with that. And adding yeast to coffee does a couple of different things to it. Some of them I liked, some of them I didn't like. But one of the things that I thought was most important, and I still think is important, is added yeast, I think, adds shelf life to the coffee, which is an important aspect of coffee because I do think, for example, patio drying, quick drying, all that kind of thing, I think detracts shelf life from the coffee. I'm talking from my experience of tasting coffees later on in the year. And I don't
Okay.
have any scientific backing to it, so I just want to do a disclaimer on that too.
Not at all. No,
No,
I'd love to get your thoughts on
my
how
thoughts
much
on it.
longer have you noticed it?
Well, I remember thinking like tasting coffees in March that were outstanding, and then tasting them in October and being like, what the heck happened to this coffee?
Right.
So it was at least making them last throughout the year. It was at least making them last until December. But at the same time, if I'm going to be completely honest, that might have been us also learning how to treat coffee better, and it could have been a whole variety of other things. It could not have been it could have or could not have been the yeast. But my impression was that added yeast did increase shelf life. But then again, all of a sudden, then there was a pushback against there wasn't really a pushback against yeast. There was a pushback against maybe adding anything. So then we
Yeah.
stopped adding anything to the coffee just to make sure that no, everybody was like, yeah, no, we are not we're not doing anything. Nothing is being added that is not part of the coffee itself. Because these yeasts are coffee yeast. They're the Pichia, the Saccharomyces, the same yeast. We actually have a lab too on our farm where we study things like yeast and things like soils and things like that. We try and so that we have an idea of what we have. So these yeasts that were being added were coffee yeast, but we didn't want to have anything like, so we started thinking, and this climate control will make, let's say, a natural coffee. We harvest it, we wash it or float it, we put it into this climate control room. It might take approximately 8, it can take 10, it can even take weeks to dry because it's got a humidity control and it's going to be cooler than outside. So it's going to be
Naturally,
very, very
yes.
slowly dried. And I don't have experience with this yet, so I'm not sure if what I'm saying, but my belief behind that would be that the slowness and the way that it's treated, where it's not shocked by anything, would also help extend the life of the coffee. Plus, obviously, things like shipping it by air or not leaving it out on a tarmac, or not leaving it on a container where it might, there's so many things that happen after it leaves the farm that we don't have a lot of control over. So we try and ship by air if we think it's very high end coffee, of course. But then you run into other things. So you run into other things in shipping by air. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of issues with shipping, but that's a whole other story.
We talked about earlier that until we do the cupping, we're not entirely sure what our inputs and our efforts did. What kind of quality measures have we implemented in Hacienda La Esmeralda to ensure that we do give ourselves the best chance at cupping, that we are still getting the best product?
For one thing, obviously we're going to cup absolutely everything. Sometimes
Yes.
I am going to, because we have so much coffee, for example, this year, every single day I had clients at the same time. So, and I can't cup 2 tables in the morning and then in the after. Like I need to cup my coffee in the morning to be able to keep all things equal.
Yeah.
So sometimes I have to cup with clients at the same time. Sometimes they'll prefer something that I am not necessarily thinking is going to be the best thing to put into our Esmeralda special or something like that. And then I have to negotiate with myself whether or not I'm willing to sell that as a special, or if it was something that I was going to downgrade to our private collection label. So I might take out a little bit of it if they really, really like it. Or, for example, if it's a coffee that they know that will work for them well in a competition, even though it would not necessarily normally be an Esmeralda special. We will go through the quality control. We use Cropster to have all of our information, to keep all of our information from the cupping scores. One of the things is we do have roasting issues sometimes, and so we have to go back and re-roast some coffees several times, especially if they're very dense coffees, or if they're fresh, or if they have some sort of a roast issue. Then we have to go back and understand, why are we having a roast issue with this particular coffee. In fact, that reminds me of one coffee that we have this year that I never was able to sell. I never found out. It should have been a spectacular coffee. Every single time I tried it, and not one single time did it taste spectacular, so it ended up being downgraded. And I have to understand, for example, what happened with that coffee. It wasn't super high elevation. It was about 1850, but that's a good elevation for
Yeah,
Geisha
yeah.
coffee. And I'm just not really sure what happened to it. I don't know if it was, I might actually have it genetically tested. It might be that there was Catuais mixed in there or something like that. But for example, in the case of something like that, well, it's just, we're not gonna, if I don't know what's going on, I can't offer it. But most of the times, I'm going to have people there. I'm going to be cupping the coffee, and they're going to be like, "Oh, I really want this." And it's like, okay, yeah, and they'll buy it off of the cupping table, because those initial ones are easy to sell off of the cupping table. When you know a coffee is great, everybody knows it's great, and they're going to want it right away.
Yeah.
So yeah, but we'll go through it, and I will try and put a variety of out. A lot of people, for example, ask for varietals, but we don't have a lot of varietals. We have a very small quantity of that. Well, we have Catuai, but when people are talking about varietals, they're not talking about Catuai. They're talking about SLs, they're talking about Laurina, they're talking about Pacamara, they're talking about those types of varieties. So yeah, and I try to have enough of that stuff out. But in terms of Esmeralda, so I am going to be cupping with or without clients, and I'm going to be doing my Cropster, and I'm going to write in my Cropster my opinions on all these things. And on some occasions, somebody will want a coffee off the cupping table, but I will know that it's coffee that unfortunately was too good, and that I'm going to withhold either for BOP or for the Esmeralda auction. So, and we will go through these cuppings as many times as we will do. Some of these will cup, up to 12 or 15 times this year. It was less because we just had so many micro lots I can't explain. Next year, we're going to try and go back a little bit and not have so many micro lots, because I think I don't know, we had at least 400, 450
Yeah, it
different
was
micro.
crazy, the number
It
of
was insane.
microlots.
It was just crazy. So yeah, but it's good to have options. That's the thing. Like some
No,
people are
I was almost curious to ask, was that the first year you've done that, and
so
why?
many, yes. So we had a new person working with us in
Ah,
our warehouse, and she just graduated from Zamorano, which is an ag school here in Honduras and Central America, but it's the best ag school here. And a
right.
lot of our students do come from Zamorano, and she had just come in last year. So we're like, okay, let's give her basically the special processes, what we think are going to be Esmeralda special, which at the end of the day are those most of the time that are not dried on patio and are not dried and machine dried. So she did all of the processing for the micro lots that we thought were going to end up being a red label. And then I had the other guy do the one who had been there before, doing the more traditional. He's just very traditional, and sometimes that mindset is hard to get out of. And we're not in a spot right now where we can just go with tradition. You have to have both tradition, but also innovation. So that's kind of tricky. You got to have everything at the same time. Try and make it all work. And so anyway, she came and she was like, and so we were like, oh, we would split up one lot if it had enough, in all of these different processes, because we wanted to be able to see which processes we liked.
Right.
Do we actually prefer? So if you have an F on your sample, it means that it was fermented in a cool room.
Yep.
And if you have a C, it means it was climate controlled. And if you have a W, it means it was washed ambient temperature. And if you have a B, it means it was dried outside on the drying beds, and so on and so forth. So we had these comparisons one next to the other, where we could try all these different processes on one single coffee that was exactly the same lot. So, because if you do different processes on different coffees and it's not the same lot, it's all things are obviously not the same. But
Yeah,
if it's
too many
exactly the same lot,
variables.
yeah, then you know that was exactly the same coffee. So the variables are removed. There's not so many variables. We did other process experiments this year having to do with when we depulp. So we were receiving coffee at noon, depulping at noon, depulping at as soon as it came in, which is around 6 p.m., and depulping the next day in the morning, which is what we did for many years. We would receive the coffee at night, and then we thought, it'll add a little bit of fruitiness. It's not very hot. It just rests there. And then the following morning, we would go through the depulping and the whatever, if it's going to go into a fermentation tank, or if it's going to, well, actually, if it's a natural and it's not going to have any process at all, it just goes straight onto the beds. But if it's a natural, it's going to have an anaerobic fermentation. It does have to go through basically it's a washing station. So we also wanted to see, what differences do we have in florality when we depulp the same day when it comes in, when we depulp that afternoon, when we depulp the next day. And I'm going to be honest to you right now, I don't remember. I would have to look at the notes to see which did best. They were
I
called
imagine
A,
it's a
B,
lot of
C.
data points.
It is a lot of data points. It is a lot. But yeah, there's so many different. We did experiments on drying the coffee on the top bed versus the lower bed outside, for example, because obviously the top bed is going to dry faster, even if it's under a cover, because the bottom bed is going to be shaded by the top bed. So all these different types of experiments to see what we like best. Because I have to sell it, so I have to like it. So it actually has to be something that I really like. The funky, unfortunately, I'm not a super fan of the anaerobic ASD type of stuff, all those funky cacao nibs and sort of tending towards a little bit of soy sauce, sort of. It's a lot for me. And I understand it, but it's not my cup of tea specifically. So I stay away from that most of the time, even though I worry sometimes that we maybe should be going a little bit stronger for competitions. But anyway, at the end, I mean, what you like is probably what you should sell.
Well, dare I say, with the amount of experience you have, you also know how the market's going to broadly respond to certain
True as well.
notes.
And I know how the market responds to us specifically, like what they expect from Esmeralda, and it's important that I don't give something entirely not what they expected from an Esmeralda, because that's very disappointing to people when they receive a coffee and they're disappointed by it. It's not what I'm looking for, of course. And I
Definitely
try,
got a reputation to uphold and maintain.
and they have certain expectations from us in terms of florality, in terms of how clean the coffee is going to be, and things like that. Like other farms might have less expectations because I haven't been dealing with them for so many years or seen them, but people kind of want, it's like if I'm going to change my branding, I can change my branding a little bit, but I can't wildly change my branding because people need to know that it's still Esmeralda. So the flavor, to me, the authenticity of the flavor has to be there as well. And authenticity and flavor to me all has to do with terroir. It's all about, does it have the flavors that come from here? Does it have, I can go, obviously the stone fruit and the bergamot and the jasmine. Obviously those are basics. Those three are basics. Jasmine, stone fruit, it can be peaches, and it can be at the same time cherries, which I love. It can be even things like olives, or it can be like avocados. Those are all stone fruits. I mean, there's a wide range of stone fruits. We only think of a couple of them, but normally it's going to be peaches, or it's going to be albaricoque. I forget the word of that name in English, but it's another stone fruit that's like yellowish versus the orange peach. And then there's like the one that if you dry it, it becomes a prune. It's called ciruela in Spanish. I already forgot the name of that too. The purple one, the big purple one. You know what I'm talking about? It's
I
also
keep
a big
thinking apricot, but that's not the right word.
apricot was the one I was thinking
The
that's
yellow
yellow.
one,
So
yeah.
that was one that we call, yes. So, and the third one is ciruela, which if you dry that out, it becomes a prune. So I don't
The
remember what that's called.
dates.
Dates, that's also dried. Isn't a date dried? I
Yeah,
think that when it's a fruit, it's called something else, but I can't remember the name.
correct, yeah.
Anyway, cherries again. Then we have all of the citrus ranges that it can go into, or it could be apple, or it could be whatever. But yeah, the bergamot, because it could be also mandarin orange, and there's just a whole variety of different flavor. Lemongrass, of course. And lemongrass is a whole thing into itself, because lemongrass, what we understand here in Panama to be lemongrass, what people from Asia understand to be lemongrass, are two entirely different things. And we use it interchangeably as if it was the same thing.
And
So
there's
that's
also
an
the
option.
tea influence also
Exactly.
claiming lemongrass as a flavor. Yeah.
But lemongrass, what we call lemongrass, is literally grass. And that grass, if you put it into tea, it smells a little bit like lemon. And if you rub it with your fingers, it smells like lemon. Whereas people in Asia, lemongrass is more like what we call a scallion. What is it's more of a vegetable that tastes a little bit oleaceous, almost a little bit like oniony. So big difference between our lemongrasses. We call it all the same. The same as lychee, for example, that we use a lot less that descriptor here than people do in broader Asia as a descriptor for geisha. Because we always are going to use the descriptors that are familiar to us, of course. So that is how that works.
Because you have so many lots. In your opinion, what the best for you? Which one the best for you?
Okay. It's going to put me in a tough position, because obviously it's difficult, but high elevation coffees are newer, like love. We have these above 2000s that we are selling as nano lots this year. And that to me have been mind-blowing this year. We had a couple called Valle. Actually, the best of, well, one of those Valles, which was outstanding, but we only had 2 or 3 kilos of it, went to Proud Mary. And it was, but I think they kept it in the US. I don't think it went to Australia, but it was insanely good. And then we had these Nidos this year, which were also, because they bring in other components. As I said, we have the basic, maybe jasmine, stone fruit, and bergamot. But when you have like things like, I don't know, gardenias, and you have all of these eucalyptus type of flavors that go into them, and they just become much more exotic and much more interesting, different. They're just different. It's a different, it's very exciting to taste them when you have them on the table for the first time, because higher elevations coffee they at the end of the day, normally they're going to be great from the very beginning until it's stone cold. Now, I'm not going to say a 1750 coffee here in Panama can also be great from the beginning to the end. But these higher elevation complex coffees that are by the way, very, very difficult to roast can be sensational. So right now I'm in love with those. That is right now what I'm, and it's both about the elevation and the process. And most of the times those are going to get all of the more techie processes, because there's so little of them. We want to make sure that they're completely controlled in their product. If you dry a coffee outside, yes, you can cover it. You can do all that stuff in the bed, but the humidity is going to go up and down during the day and during the night. The heat is going to go up and down. And when you have a climate controlled room, makes it ideal to make sure that is not going to influence, that the fermentations are not going to influence during the wrong time in the coffee. So I am super excited about, for example, the Nidos this year. The Nidos were just, George Howell took that one from our auction, which I also thought it was just an insanely good coffee this year. And that one is one of our highest one that went to about 2,100, but we have 2,200 too. So yeah, high elevation coffees, harder to grow up there. There's going to be a lot less of them. And so we're going to have to offer them more exclusively, either in auctions or for special things, or for special people that need something special on that day, or for very good clients or things like that. They're at the same time, that is what, so you asked me what, because that is like this year, I was super excited about that. Next year, I might be super excited about something different. Every year, I do try and find something to be excited about, because I think if you're not excited about what you're doing in coffee, then it's hard to be in coffee. You really have to love what you do. You have to love all the different aspects of, I can get excited about, because this is insane how this turned out. This is so good. And be excited to be able to share it with somebody as an experience, because at the end of the day, that is what coffee is about too. It's all about this experience of us tasting these different things that we didn't at one point even know we could find in coffee. So that is part of what I love about coffee, is finding all these different things. And in a group, or even in like in a BOP group, we can get excited. We'll find a coffee that nobody even knows whose it is and be like, wow, what an amazing coffee. Coffee bonds us when we taste it together, and we're like, and we all have sort of the same expectations for it. So, and we'll see what happens next year. And as I said, those super high elevation coffees, I might be excited about them this year to drink again in a very calm experience where you can even leave it and have it until it's very, very cold. But I have a whole range of other coffees that I think are good for other things, because not necessarily everybody needs that one experience. They have other experiences that maybe they want to drink the coffee hot. Maybe that is going to be part of that experience. And then you should offer them something that at that moment when the client is going to drink it, is going to best bring out whatever they need. It's like I have baristas who will come and want lower elevation geishas because in a espresso drink, they're not so acidic. A very high elevation coffee in espresso drink is basically undrinkable. It's just like so sour. But if you take a lower elevation that's going to, be less acidic, then it'll bring out the florality, but it won't make it so hard to drink in an espresso. So we used to think that we couldn't use espressos at all. Like I'm talking about 10, 15 years ago. And then we started seeing baristas that were using them. I'm like, okay, so this is the way they do it. So basically I don't know, they have to try and manage the acidity when they're doing it in an espresso-based drink. Now in a barista and a Brewers Cup competition, it's different though. In a Brewers Cup competition, at that moment when those judges are cupping, well, I think they cup it 3 different times. Like I believe that's when I think it's 3. But then you have to make sure that it's consistent and it has all the notes during those 3 different times. And that's a whole other cup of tea, making sure that you have the 3 notes or those notes during the times when you're saying you have those notes. So I don't know. It's a whole broad range of different things that one thinks about when you're trying to decide what we think would be good for what, or who's going to like what. And the US market versus, let's say, the Chinese market or the Japanese market or the Korean market or the European market. They're all very different. Now, Southeast Asia is very much aligned with the Asian, with China, with Korea, with Japan. Interestingly, Europe seems more aligned with the US and Canada, but Europe seems to be looking for more exclusive high-end stuff right now. The US, some roasters are too. It depends. But the US started out being our strongest market in 2004. Then we basically, almost everything went to Asia. And still more than 50% of our coffee, for sure. Close to 75% of our coffee goes to between China and Taiwan and Korea and Japan. So
When did that start? When did the Asian market start to take over when you started off so strongly in the US?
Around when we started with our own auctions in 2008, when it was able to go to different places where all they had to do was buy the sample box, cup the coffees, and sign up for our auction. We didn't have to actually communicate, because that was one of the original problems with Asian countries, is that I don't speak their language and they don't speak my language. But we've found ways to get past that. I mean, there's all sorts of translators now too that work actually pretty well. Like maybe not Google Translate for things, especially when we're talking about characters.
Yes.
But if you use DeepL, for example, that works very well. Most of the time, I've had no issues with that, translating back and forth with especially because simplified Chinese works okay with Google Translate, but not traditional Chinese. So that is where the DeepL comes in, and it's a whole thing. Anyway, yeah, all of those have been steps. And then a lot of China still thinks that we only sell auction coffee. Like they think that we only sell on auction, which is insane, because we don't even sell like 1% of our coffee in the auction. But it's a language barrier issue at the same time, you know what I mean? Because they just don't know because it's not out there that publicly.
You
But
mentioned
no,
that the
it's not.
split between kind of the US, Europe, and then the Asian preferences for coffee. Could you share more
So
about that?
Europe is okay. Let me think about this a little bit. Europe is a lot more price sensitive than any of the Asian countries, and so is the US. So for starters, the price sensitivity a lot of the times leads some of them to want to look at the varietals. But if they taste a good geisha, they will buy a good geisha that has all these attributes that I'm telling you, the florality, but
Yeah.
just in smaller quantities. Whereas in Asia, I don't know, I think this is again, my way of thinking on this, and it's something sort of made up. When I first went to China in 2012, I went to Beijing and I went to Shanghai and to Beijing. The coffee shops that were supposed to be selling more coffee or more, let's say, towards specialty coffee were not specialty coffee. And I went back in 2016, and 2016, there was already specialty coffee. So in those 4 years, something huge happened in China. And when I went back in 2016, they knew what geisha was. It's 2016. I think it was 2016. I went to Hotel X and we had this very small booth outside of Hotel X. But 90 Plus was already there because Jason Wang from Jazz Blue had started working with Joseph Brodsky at 90 Plus, and Andres de la Torre had started working with the Hartmans. So there was Hartman coffee in different coffee shops in Beijing and Shanghai in 2016 when I went. And I believe that from 2012, that coffee that was not that great, that didn't do great, to 2016, when good coffees came in, these Asian markets never had bad coffees like the US did, or like instant coffees like UK had for so many years, or most of Europe. These Asian coffees did not drink, instant coffee, Folgers. They did not drink these very cheap versions of coffee that the US had during the war or that Europe had. So they didn't have the experience to start with that. And when they tasted that, they were probably like, oh, I don't like this. But when they started tasting good coffee, they're like, oh, I can understand this because they already had that sort of experience with good teas. So they didn't have the initial reaction against the high price because they have very hugely much more expensive than coffee teas growing there.
Yes.
And I believe that whole culture was what made it easier for all of these coffees to go to these Asian markets. And now, like, Europe is sort of catching up back up, and the US is coming back on board about that too, about it being them being willing to pay a little bit more to ensure that this is a very high-end experience, but not as much as in Asian countries where that's just they're not going to take anything that doesn't have that appeal of something that's super juicy and floral and very easy to drink. That's what I think. They didn't start with bad coffee, so it wasn't such a jump when they got a good coffee to pay a price that made more sense versus whatever you would pay for Folgers or for an instant coffee.
Feels a bit like the Australian experience. We've just spoiled with the level of coffee that we almost refuse to go back to something
Well, your
that's below
coffee
standard.
is outstanding too, and I'm not sure why Australia evolved. Maybe also again the Asian influence in Australia. It might be
So
because
my understanding of the Australian coffee experience is the Greek and Italian migrants post World War II.
raw coffee first, yeah.
And then
But they wouldn't call it
because they
bad
were
coffee.
kind of separated
Italian,
from the original Italian experience, it did get to develop its own sense of culture and way of doing things in Australia. But with that kind of initial knowledge of here's how to do espresso. And then that's where I've seen the kind of split. Because then if, as an Australian, we go to Europe, it's disappointing, to put it mildly.
honestly, I have never been in a place where you have such good coffee and such good food at the same time. Australia to me is like there's nothing like it. I've been around lots of places, and you guys have amazing coffee and at the same time amazing food. So you have an expectation, which a lot of parts of the world don't have. So I imagine to you to go to a coffee shop anywhere in the world, you're like, well, why?
What are you most excited about that's coming up in coffee?
Well, I am excited. Well, I'm actually very excited to see how our new varietals are going to turn out, but that's not going to be next year. In general, I am excited to see more of a trend back towards terroir and away from processing that covers up the terroir more than anything. I mean, I understand that all of us can't have the same terroir. So first of all, I'm not by this trying to say I don't have any problem with anybody adding whatever they want to their coffee. That's fine. And I do not have any issue with that. I think that's perfectly acceptable as long as you are perfectly transparent about what you're doing. That as long as you tell people that this is what you did, I think that's fine. I think people need to have a way to differentiate themselves. And that's the way some producers go to try and find that way. As long as you're clear about what you're doing, I think that's fine. But I'm talking about just overprocessing, what I feel as overprocessing. And I just think the flavor of the terroir is beautiful when it's well expressed. And going back towards that craftsmanship of finding a way to balance out the process with the variety itself. I think regeneration in soils is also a big thing. We've been using soils for a long time. So that is something that I think that is an important part of what's coming up. Is regenerating. I think that might be, I mean, in some countries where they've been using the same soils year after year and they don't have shades and things like that. And I think regenerating those soils, shading them honestly, would make a big difference in a lot of places. But it's hard to do if you're not selling coffee the way that we are able to here in Panama. It's hard to go out on a limb and try and make experiments, because you could lose your whole crop, or you could lose half of it. Let's say you're in Honduras and you want to try a shade grown coffee and you get a fungus out of all of these coffees because whatever. And it's difficult because once you are differentiated and you are making a wage that you can cover making these experiments for, it makes things easier. So, I don't know. It's hard to say it's hard for me to give people any sort of advice because I know that I am in a very unique position right now. So, and I do completely understand, as I said, differentiating yourself, finding different ways to differentiate yourself to make your coffee special or unique or give it an edge where people need to be able to buy it.
Hopefully one day we can all get as lucky as Panama.
Exactly. Hopefully coffee evolves one day where it's not seen as being lucky only, because otherwise it's not really very sustainable. The tea prices are the same prices as 20 years ago. How does that work? How did everything in the world cost so much more now? The price for coffee is the same. It's crazy. So I know it doesn't affect me directly, but I look at it and I find it incredible to believe that is still happening.
I mean, one part of me hopes that the auction prices we saw this year kind of filters the way down to the rest of the market.
Well, especially because it filters down to varietals. It definitely filters down to something, but it needs to filter all the way down.
Yeah.
All the way down to just any coffee that was produced that the buyer or that the coffee producer needs to live off of that, because that is where most of the problems are. And these small producers in these countries that don't have a way to find a market, or because they just don't have the access to find that. Yeah. Same old story. What can we say? It's the same old story that we've been talking about for 20 years, by the way.